So I was still in the Catholic Church as I was married and finding quite a bit of good stuff for me, for myself there, because I love the liturgy. But moving to Georgia into the Bible Belt felt like I moved to a desert for my own soul. Nothing was quite fitting together. So I'm just giving you a little background on the journey of faith that leads up to this experience with centering prayer. Yeah, so I spent a lot of years where I felt like I didn't have a place. I didn't know where I fit. But God was faithful always, and I never lost that place in myself, except a couple of times where, by God's design, I experienced what we would call a dark night of the soul, or even a dark night of the senses, where faith is just raw. It's just faith in whatever. I mean, you don't even know but you have it. It's there. You can trust it. But I guess the biggest turning point was when my husband and I took a trip to Glacier Park. His brother lives out there, and his only son, had drowned and in a river, and he had had his ashes for 7 years. And it was such a God thing, because they live in Montana and we're in Georgia, so we don't see them that often. But for some reason that spring, my husband and I were at the dinner table and talking about, we really need to go see your brother. It's time. We need to get out there and see them. Hadn't seen him since his son had died. And the phone rang while we were at dinner, and he asked us to come to see him that summer because he wanted to spread his son's ashes. Well, it was just like, well, yes, of course we're coming. And so we hiked 6 miles. I couldn't do this today, but we hiked 6 miles up to the top of the mountain. And I forget where it was in Glacier exactly, but it was one of the U.S. postal areas where they used to go by horseback. And there was a lodge there at the top. I think it was called the Sperry Lodge, which burned down a couple summers ago. And we stayed overnight there, and we then hiked out into the back behind the place and walked 21 miles. And during that time, we did spread his ashes. We had a little service under a rock that had become our sanctuary. And it was very emotional, but also it was, there's no words sometimes for things. But we crossed 55 waterfalls. We saw mountain lion, all kinds of incredible beauty, crossed snowfields. And when we exited that hike, all I could do was cry for days. I couldn't even talk. I just found myself sort of dumbstruck, but I couldn't quite wrap any words around anything. So I went home and still had no words. And you see, I don't have trouble using words, but at this point in my life, I had no words. And I was talking to God about it, like, God, Lord, I've never been able to not speak or hear from you, or, what's going on. So this went on for a while, maybe a couple of weeks. And as I was, one day, as it would be, I would walk through the living room, and I heard the words in my head that came so clearly out of nowhere. I'm in between the words. And you know how it is, if you get a clear words, you stop in your tracks, and you notice, you pay attention, and that's never left, those words. So that began sort of an interior journey then. I stopped trying to fit in. Yay. And I stopped striving and trying to make things work. And I didn't go to those little Bible studies that drove me crazy. Instead, circle every word, and I don't know. They're good. I'm not saying they're bad, but they just weren't for me. So as then God began to send people into my life that were so important to my formation. And also then I was led into a spiritual formation program, spiritual direction. It was a Jesuit school in Alabama that had a place in Atlanta and so I registered, and they said they had no openings. And I was like, well, that's fine. I wasn't really sure what I was doing. I was just sort of checking this out because people had encouraged me to look into this. I went home that night And there was a message on my phone that said that person had dropped out of the program and they would like me to be part of their cohort. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, I had no idea what it was going to involve, schoolwork or money. I mean, it was going to cost a lot of money. My husband at the time was on Young Life staff. I was teaching art part-time. We didn't have the money. So as it turns out, I got a full scholarship. So I really know it was God's way of providing exactly what I needed at the perfect time in my life. The kids are out of the house, and just a definitely transition time for me. So I guess the first encounter with extended silence, this program required 2 5 to 7 days silent retreats. I had never done that before. And the first one was terrifying. It just felt like an out-of-body experience. It was definitely difficult. And the second one was better. And then it began to be like, wow, this is amazing. The transformation that happens in silence and solitude. You can't explain it, and if God is leading you, then, you do it. It's not something you just decide to do. I believe God's behind all of it in all of our lives. He's the author and finisher of everything. So our journey, he's instructing us and leading us. When I lost all those words, I began to have an aversion to words. And so I also began to have aversion to sermons in church. It was just bizarre. And I thought, I'm losing my faith. Everything sort of was crumbling. All my normal ways of praying, all my normal ways of hearing from God, everything was falling down. It was crumbling around me, and it needed to. At the time, you don't realize that, but it needed to happen. All right, so centering prayer. It has changed my life. It has become easy. It was not easy at the beginning, and how I learned through a lot of failure. Centering prayer, just called prayer of the heart, kind of started back with the Desert Fathers. So the practice is to first I would say one of the biggest and important parts is surrender and your intention. So you come to the prayer time with the simple intention of being with God, not God as a thought, not even God as a being, which is very difficult, but just to be open and fully present so that God's action can happen in you. So you're placing yourself, in a sense, at God's disposal, completely surrendered. And so, as Cynthia Burgo would say, it's like kenosis, when Jesus gave up, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. So it is that type of posture that you come into the prayer with. And in the beginning stages of centering prayer, it's best to start with just a few minutes a day to establish a practice, like maybe 5 minutes, and you show up. Just showing up is probably the biggest and hardest step that you'll take. It's just showing up, and you're going to do nothing. It's hard to do nothing. We're so used to doing something, and we're so used to getting something out of prayer. And all of these changes that happen within us are subtle, and you see them in your life. You see them the fruits are seen in your life. So it's also suggested to maybe use a sacred word to keep you sort of grounded. Think of centering prayer as a plumb line. It's like gravity. Gravity is to the earth as God is, or silence is, to our souls. So you're not using words, and you're actually not trying to use thoughts about God. Your prayer is in the heart space, not here. And your prayer is more of an abiding, being together in communion. So it's more of a communion with God. The purpose of this prayer, too, is not to get rid of your thoughts, but actually the work of the prayer, and it is work, it's called the work of contemplation, is not to become attached to your thoughts. So I know Judy was so relieved when I told her, you don't have to try to get rid of your thoughts, because you never will. That's impossible. But you will notice them during the prayer period, and you will return to your sacred word, which will bring you like an anchor into God's presence. So your sacred word is not an emotional word. That's also important. It becomes more like a placeholder. So it can be a simple word like, here I am, or being. the word love, sometimes has too much around it. So you just want to keep it very simple and non-emotional if possible. And I also had suggested to our group that it was sort of like a windshield wiper. So when you notice yourself making the grocery list or thinking about yesterday or making plans for whatever's down the road, you're attempting to stay in the present moment with the Lord, and you want to guard that space, and that word becomes like a windshield wiper. Whoops, okay. Or you can see yourself on the side of the bank of a river, and you're just sort of with Jesus on the bank, and you're watching your thoughts go down. You're just letting them go down the river. So anyway, that's it. It's your intention, which is in the will. Lord, I choose to be with you at this time. I have no expectations other than to be with you. I'm not looking for some. And sometimes during the prayer, you will find that you'll get this great illumination. You'll have like an amazing, like a revelation of some sort. Even that needs to be let go. So it's a neutralizing, it's detachment. It doesn't mean you don't care. It just means that my ego is disengaged and my heart is open. So you're keeping vigil, which when Jesus said to the disciples in the garden, can you just stay awake with me a few minutes? And they couldn't. And it is difficult for us. Does that help, Judy? Was that clear, Judy?
Yes, indeed. So
Okay.
you're saying that kind of like the Philippians 2 emptying, we're kind of emptying ourselves of our agenda, even our ways of managing God.
Right.
And just coming to a place where we're just keeping company with him. And when we get distracted, because we will, which was so helpful to me when you said that, we just choose a gentle word and come back to that place of non-attachment, of freedom, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. I like this little quote. I used it in my first talk, and it is a narrow path. I like to think of centering prayer as a narrow path because it's the way of the cross. So the death to the ego, which is the kernel of wheat, right? The husk that has to fall away and die. And so it really is. I think the second half of life is a lot of chaos and disassembling and losing and loss. And as you get older, you lose so much. I feel like I've come to so many bottoms. I'm like, I know there'll be more. The ultimate being my life, giving my life up to the Lord at the end of my life. But I'm grateful that I feel like this is part of my preparation, to be able to really let go. And so in centering prayer, I had written this: you are not trying to get anywhere, feel anything, acquire anything. You're opening yourself to the hidden work of God, which is totally out of our control. And like Judy said, you're not manipulating the prayer time. You're not trying to accomplish anything. That's hard for us as Americans. You're trusting what you cannot know, cannot see, and cannot understand with the limitations of your finite mind. So, God you can't worship God with thought. It's a different process. So it's a receptive passivity. You're not asleep. Your heart is awake, like in Song of Songs, where it says, my heart, I sleep, but my heart is awake. I think that's really a beautiful way to think of it. You're choosing. It's the act of the will. You're choosing to remain present. When you don't feel warm or fuzzy, you might feel cool or aloof, bored or apathetic. You're not trying to get anywhere, obtain anything. You're sitting in openness and trust. What helped me sometimes is to imagine that I'm blindfolded, so I have physical sense of being blindfolded and not, how that's so disorienting. As a child, you'd play games and you'd be blindfolded. Well, I can't see where I'm going. It's terrible. But sometimes that's helped me to physically do it. There was this little poem, I don't know where I read this. It said, sitting still, doing nothing, spring comes, and the grass grows by itself. We didn't really do anything to help the grass grow. And that's kind of how it is with us in our life with God. We surrender, we open, we allow, we consent, and it's God's work in us. And I'm just forever like humbled and beyond grateful at the faithfulness of God in my own life. So Judy, is there anything else? I do have this one thing that is so incredible. It's a reading. I just came across it this morning. It's written by a nun. I can't even pronounce her last name. Zvaboda. So here's the poem. And the stalk said, that's the name of this little reading. How does a grain of wheat feel as it is planted in the soil? To answer that, I imagine interviewing a stalk of wheat, for every stalk was once a grain. And here's what the stalk might say. I liked being a grain of wheat. I was proud of who I was, golden, smooth, perfectly intact. But then some farmer dug a hole and tossed me into it. What's going on? I asked, but my question was met with silence. Then the dirt came pouring down upon me. I protested. Hey, you're burying me alive. Stop. But no one heard me. I sat in total darkness, afraid. Then I felt something, moisture. At first I thought, good, I won't die of thirst. But soon I began to get soggy. I sensed my golden color was fading. My smooth exterior became wrinkly. My intactness was breached as I was split asunder. I whimpered, I'm dying. This is the end of me. Then something amazing happened. Out of my shriveled, broken, dying self, two shoots emerged. One began pushing upward and the other downward, both powered by a force within and beyond me. And my root went down, my shoot went up, until it broke through the soil and into the brightness of the sun. I was no longer a grain of wheat, but something better, a stalk of wheat. And from me would come many, many grains of wheat that would help feed the people of the world. In closing, the stalk said, trust the farmer, befriend silence and darkness, embrace transformation, willingly relinquish your intactness, believe, for the ending is really the beginning. Isn't that beautiful? Mm. I just love this writing. I just think it's beautiful. And I think that is what happens to us.
Bob, why don't you share a little bit about your experience? I'm glad you got to hear some things that Claudia said, because it's just such a good reminder.
Okay, well, thank you. It's great to be with you all. Good morning. This is not something, if you'd asked me even a year ago about the prospects of me having a conversation about centering prayer, I would have told you it's the last thing I'd be talking about. But I'm delighted that it has become such a significant experience for me, and I'll share a little about my experience. It'll probably just reinforce a lot of what Claudia has told you. Maybe Judy told you a little about this, but it was about, maybe two and a half months ago that she and I attended a couples silent retreat at Ignatius House here in Atlanta. And we were learning how to be before the Lord in silence, be open to receiving, etc. And I started experiencing what it's like to do that and learn just how challenging it was for me. Simultaneously, I've been learning a lot more about who I am from the perspective of my personality and my wiring, and in particular, my Enneagram type. And it turns out I am somewhere between a hybrid of a 8 and a 1. And I think I lean mostly to 1. Can see some of myself in both those areas. And what we know from the Enneagram is that people who have that profile are in the gut triad and need, for their ability to experience spiritual transformation, need stillness. And the concept of being still has never even occurred to me. In fact, quite the opposite. My definition of success is to be productive. And to be productive means to be engaged. And to be engaged in actively thinking or doing something that has some form of significance or value in terms of an outcome. I have to be productive. I'm a human doing, not a human being. My worth is a function of what I do, not who I am. Learning the lie in that has been a lifetime journey for me. And so this most recent experience of learning to go before the Lord in silence and then pursuing this discipline of centering prayer has been another major step in that journey for me. So I was at the Ignatius house with Judy, looked at the books on the bookshelf and saw this book on this thing called Centering Prayer. I went to one of the staff members there and said, "What can you tell me about this?" She said, "Better than that, we've got a workshop coming up." And so sure enough, they had a workshop on centering prayer. My friend Dan and I went to that workshop, spent 7 hours that day learning about this process. And I heard Claudia explaining the process to you. And we were taught exactly that. And so this morning was my 81st consecutive day of centering prayer since that day. And so I will have to confess that I take a lot of personal satisfaction in being productive in achieving 81 consecutive days of success. But apart from that, if you'll forgive me that, I have found that time to be incredibly satisfying and apparently beneficial, just in terms of how I experience my own sense of centeredness, my own sense of peace, my tendency in terms of how I react to things that I used to be triggered by is much different. I don't find myself as easily triggered with impatience or frustration or critical thinking. And I believe that's God's gift to me out of my faithfulness and in being still before him. I heard Claudia explain some of the process, and I practice a lot of what I was hearing her say. I start by, I do a reading every morning from Richard Rohr and his Center for Action and Contemplation. And then I kind of use that as my segue to set the timer and center. And I usually start with 3 deep breaths. And on the exhale of each breath, I say the following 3 things. Come, Holy Spirit, come. Come, precious Jesus, come. Come, Abba, Father, come. And then my sacred word is abide. Abide. And what's interesting about what I heard Claudia say is that when I was at that silent retreat with Judy, we had time in nature around the Ignatius house, which is right on the Chattahoochee River and running through Atlanta. So I went down to the river where there was a fallen tree. I sat on that tree looking out onto the water and literally felt the presence of God there. The Holy Spirit wind blew. It was amazing. So every time I'm in centering prayer and I say abide, I go back to that fallen tree on the river at the Chattahoochee. And whenever another thought enters my mind other than emptying my mind, I say, let it go, and I put it in that river. And it's gone. Now that sounds great, right? Let me tell you what, the mind never stops. It's amazing. I had no idea just how obsessively, compulsively engaged my mind is until I started attempting this. But the other thing I am with myself, which is unusual, is patient. And I say, okay, no big deal. And I just pray the Holy Spirit and precious Jesus and Abba Father back into my mind and abide and abide. And so while it's not perfect and never will be, I'm confident, it has been incredibly satisfying. And I'm also delighted that my friend Dan, who went with me to that workshop, is also on his 81st day. So we're traveling this road together, which I would encourage you to do, by the way. Have somebody you kind of are partnering with that you're accountable to if you want to be engaged in this, and give each other support. Any questions for me or Claudia, for that matter?
I see Tracy has a question. She says, is there space or room with centering prayer to have a blank paper or journal nearby to capture anything that comes up?
I cannot tell you how many things I have thought of in centering prayer that need to go on my to-do list. It is amazing. And everything in me wants to stop right then, grab a piece of paper and write it down. But every time I do that or think that, I recall what Maggie taught us. And that is, if it's important enough to remember, God will bring it back to mind. Let it go. Let it go. So I put it right in the river. That's my opinion. No, I would not have a piece of paper nearby. This is not about journaling. This is about being completely empty before the Lord from start to finish.
I just affirm that. So yeah, this is a little bit different. I would say maybe later you could maybe reflect on how the time was for you. And, like Bob said, if something is meant to come back to you, it will. There have been several things that have come back to me, are still with me as a result of centering prayer, where I became, like some people will say, to focus on your breath, just the breath of God, and just the breath brings you right here. And then I remember this shift that happened in the prayer time, and God brought it back because it was so powerful that I'm not the one breathing. God is breathing me. Every minute he's breathing me into existence. So see the shift there? You're taking your hands off. You're detaching from everything that comes to you. You're letting it go down the river, like Bob said. That's not during the prayer time, that's the practice. But I do remember that was a pretty significant shift in my awareness during the prayer time of being breathed, of God praying in me, not me praying. Claudia, personality, ego, Claudia over there, and something else, the stalk or the shoot, whatever it was, something else was coming up. Those will be there. They won't go away. You may not even have to write them down.